Portuguese on Oak Island, July 28, 2022. Daniel Spino. For a very long time, the Portuguese involvement with Oak Island was not being looked at close enough. Fortunately, that has changed, and one particular person figures prominently in this mystery. Evidence suggests that Antonio Prior of Crato was an integral player in the history of Oak Island. Dom Antonio appears to be the connective tissue to several theories involving the island. It is important to look at this individual very closely, leaving no stone unturned, to determine if he was the pivotal figure that he appears to have been. It's known that there was involvement by the Portuguese in Nova Scotia. Evidence indicates that the Knights of Christ explored the area, and a colony by the Portuguese Azorians was attempted, but was abandoned. Dom Antonio was a claimant to the Portuguese throne and was connected to the Knights of Christ and the Portuguese Azorians. In a letter from the Spanish ambassador to England, Bernardino de Mendoza, to King Philip II of Spain, dated August 15, 1580, it states, "A Portuguese named Juan Rodrigues de Souza, a man 32 years of age, a Knight of the Order of Christ, comes from Dom Antonio with letters for the Queen, the Earl of Leicester, and Secretaries Walsingham and Wilson." De Souza was Dom Antonio's emissary. At the time, the Azores had a large contingent of Knights of Christ that were loyal to Dom Antonio. He had the connections in the Azores that would have made him very aware of Nova Scotia and any colony there. Records show that Dom Antonio had a treasure and a mint in the Azores before the Spanish attacked in 1583. Both disappeared before the Spanish arrived. Around the same time, the Portuguese Azorians withdrew from Nova Scotia, claiming they could no longer protect their interests. Records indicate that the French aided Dom Antonio against the Spanish and were attempting to help him with his treasure. Records also indicate that he was getting assistance from Queen Elizabeth and the English. It has been established that Dom Antonio was closely connected to Sir Francis Drake. This is important because Drake has long been suspected of being involved with Oak Island in separate theories, and he figures prominently in the historical record involving Dom Antonio. In 1589, Dom Antonio secretly signed several clauses that would turn Portugal into an English possession if he were to retake the Portuguese throne. Queen Elizabeth sent the English Armada against Spain after the Spanish Armada failed to capture England. Sir Francis Drake was the commanding admiral of the English Armada. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was also part of this operation. He had become a close associate of Antonio's, according to several sources. The English naval contingent consisted partly of the Queen's ships and partly of privateers who joined in search of booty and Dom Antonio himself. Drake and the commander of the land forces, John Norris, had a plan of placing Dom Antonio on the throne of Portugal after a decisive victory against the Spanish, but without the Queen's permission. Dom Antonio mistakenly believed that his presence would incite an uprising against King Philip II. This did not happen, and the assault was a complete disaster that put him into further debt. A defeated Dom Antonio returned to England and became involved with the intrigue of the Lopez plot. Dr. Rodrigo Lopez was a Portuguese Sephardic Jew, reportedly a new Christian, forced convert, who moved to England in 1559. Lopez was accused during the Portuguese Inquisition of being a Marrano, one who practiced Judaism in secret. This forced him to relocate to England. He was Antonio's doctor when he was in Portugal. Once in England, he became the physician to the Queen and other important nobles like Sir Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, Francis Walsingham and Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex and others. He also acted as Dom Antonio's interpreter and liaison after he arrived in England. There were rumors that Lopez was trying to kill Dom Antonio for King Philip II of Spain. It was discovered that Dr. Lopez had secret correspondences with Spanish officials and that he had given the Spanish information about the English court and apparently donated money to a secret synagogue in Antwerp, Belgium, a hub for Sephardic Jews at the time. History records that Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was furious with Dr. Lopez because he had breached his doctor-client privilege and talked to Dom Antonio and the Spanish exile Antonio Perez about treating Essex for a venereal disease. This breach of confidentiality may have compelled Essex to silence Lopez before he had a chance to reveal other secrets that him and his associates were involved in. Essex accused Lopez of not only trying to poison Dom Antonio, but also the Queen. Several witnesses testified that Lopez was involved in this plot. Lopez was tried by a commission headed by Essex in February 1594. Francis Bacon was assigned by Essex to gather information about the case and wrote, "A true report of the detestable treason intended by Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, 1594, which was distributed after the trial." The prosecutor, Sir Edward Coke, denounced the doctor as a perjured, murdering villain and a Jewish doctor worse than Judas himself, and not a new Christian, but a very Jew. Lopes insisted that he was innocent, but had confessed under threat of torture, then recanted. Dr. Lopez was convicted of high treason and sentenced to death. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. The Queen feared it was too dangerous for Dom Antonio to remain in England, so King Henry IV agreed to allow him to return to France. His remaining jewels were sold one by one to the highest bidder to cover his debts. The last and finest was later included among the crown jewels of France. During his last days, Antonio lived on a small pension given by the king. He died in Paris in August 1595. Dom Antonio's last will and testament was signed as King of Portugal. In a letter written by the Spanish diplomat Count Gondomar to King Philip II, sometime after the Lopez trial, it indicated that Dr. Lopez was unjustly convicted, and there had been no plot involving the doctor and the Spanish to kill Queen Elizabeth. Another not-so-well-known fact about Dom Antonio is that he was involved in the slave trade in Africa. In 1588, he, along with the English government, signed the Guinea Charter. It granted, for 10 years, the right for English merchants to work in the slave trade hub of Guinea, an area that Dom Antonio claimed was still his possession. A special duty was paid accounting for 5% of all goods sold. These profits would be sent to Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, who the Privy Council chose to collect the duties and pay off Dom Antonio's English creditors. After some disagreements with some of the merchants, Dom Antonio brought legal charges against some of them for evading the duties. This situation reignited England's involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. This operation could have been the source for slave labor that may have been used on Oak Island for any large construction project during that time period. It is very clear that Dom Antonio was a desperate individual. He sold the crown jewels of Portugal to finance his attempts at reclaiming the Portuguese throne. He procured a large treasure that disappeared. Reports indicate that the treasure was hidden. It is possible that this treasure was brought to Oak Island via the assistance of the Portuguese Azoreans, the French and the English. Evidence suggests that Dom Antonio was the conduit for the transmission of the location of Oak Island to both English and French interests. These multinational interests were connected by religious orders, chivalric orders, and a specific brotherhood. Another compelling detail is that the English parties that Antonio befriended and confided in while he was in England were some of the same players that are suspected to have written and influenced the works of Shakespeare. This group included Francis Bacon, Anthony Bacon, Robert Devereux, Henry Wriothesley, Edward de Vere, Francis Drake, and more. This is how the Shakespearean theory connects to Oak Island. Although it involves much more than just a question of true authorship of literature, it involves this group being involved with the reorganization and development of a specific fraternal order that would be connected to Oak Island to the present day. Thank you, Daniel, for all your insights on Oak Island from all your Quest members around the world.